Okay, here we go on our third one. We're going to talk about strategies and advantages during the Civil War. South basic strategy was pretty simple. They needed to fight a defensive war and force the Union to recapture them and force them back into the Union and try to get foreign help. If they got foreign help, much like we did in the American Revolution, then they had a very good chance of winning the war. So it was a pretty simple strategy for them. Just don't lose. Now, the North, a little different situation. They had what they called their Anaconda Plan, which was very simple also. They looked at the Mississippi River and said, first thing we should do is capture the Mississippi, which was one of their main points, coming down from the north and up from the south, down from up from New Orleans. So that was the first part. Second part was to capture Richmond and squeeze the southern capital and come into that area. The third part was to use their Navy, which the Union had a much better Navy, obviously, than the South did, because the South didn't have really much of a Navy. And by doing so, they would be able to squeeze the South in like an anaconda, snake, which would squeeze its prey. They would be able to squeeze the South and stop them from fighting. It worked in many ways, as we're going to see during this time period of the battles. So there were the strategies of it. Now, the advantages each side had were numerous. The South had obviously the advantage of better generals because most of the Southerners had gone to West Point, or at least most of the West Point graduates were Southerners, the good ones were, and they stayed in the South. Lee and Jackson and Longstreet and those guys. As a matter of fact, Lincoln had wanted Lee to be the head of the Union Army, and Lee turned him down. They also had the situation where they had support of England and France, and England actually helped them build some ships, raiders that would raid Union merchant ships. They had better soldiers, as I said earlier. They were more used to the fighting and riding, etc., etc. The South had the best cavalry throughout most of the war. They only had to fight a defensive war, which was very important to them because then they didn't have to win. Only thing they had to do was not lose. They fought on their home territory, which was both a good and a bad thing because while they knew the territory and it was easy for them, they didn't have to transport supplies far. When the war did go down in the South was pretty much decimated, and that's going to cause problems when we get to the Reconstruction era. So in that sense, and of course the South had a very strong morale because they were fighting for what they felt was their existence, and that tends to make you fight much harder if you realize that if you do not win, you will lose everything that you have. So there were the South advantages. The North had some major strong advantages also. Money being one of the main ones. The North had quite a bit more money from all of the various gold strikes that had been going on at the time, both in California and Nevada and places like that. They had more men, and if you look on page 476, you'll notice the discrepancy of the size of the Union Army compared to the Southern Army as the war went on. And so obviously the more men came in, the better it was for the North. They were bringing literally people over, immigrants who were coming over. They were landing on the docks, and they were being signed up for the Union Army. Many of them didn't even speak English. So they had all that. They had much better transportation back and forth to the South. The southern rivers were kind of, as they said, arrows into the South, where the North didn't have that. They had the railroads, et cetera, et cetera. They can transport better. Just made it much easier for them to transport things back and forth. They had a better government. They were already unionized. They already had a union. Their government was established. They really didn't have to change anything up much. They could establish it. They could just keep going the way they were going right at this point in time. So this North was much stronger in that sense. They didn't have to worry about setting up a government, setting up a constitution, et cetera, et cetera. They had Lincoln. The book, I think, will tell you in there that if they had switched sides and Jefferson Davis had been on the North and Lincoln had been on the South might have won. Lincoln was a fantastic politician who knew what to do, when to do it, and how to do it. While many in the Washington, D.C. area dismissed him as being a hillbilly, that tall, gangly guy who wasn't very smart, et cetera, he was a brilliant politician and knew exactly what needed to be done when it needed to be done. And as you'll see during the Civil War, he'll do whatever needs to be done to win the war, including breaking the law if he has to. And he broke the law many times, but ultimately he said, my goal was to win the war and preserve the Union, and then, of course, later to free the slaves. They also had, as I said, their Navy, which was very strong. Most of Annapolis graduates were Union. Northerners, and so they had a much better Navy, and that they used to stop the South. And of course, oh, and last, industry. I forgot about industry. The industry, the majority of the industry was in the North, so they were able to produce many more things that the South never was able to. As a matter of fact, as the war goes on, the South is fighting more and more, trying to get things for their army than they were, and they were fighting more and more at a disadvantage because the North had guns, ammunition, clothing, etc., etc. The South many times had to steal from the Northern dead just to provide for their troops. At the Battle of Gettysburg, one of the reasons they were going there was there was a shoe factory there, and many Southerners were marching along without shoes because they had no more shoes. So this industry really benefits the North and really hinders the South. And of course, then the blockade, not allowing any supplies to come into the South, really does a lot of damage to the South. And ultimately, that is going to turn the war towards the South because they're able to do all of the, or towards the North, excuse me, because they were able to stop all of those supplies coming in, and they basically just outsupplied the South and outmanned the South. So by the end of the war, that is going to be the major downfall for the South in many ways. And we will pick up with the war itself when I come back the next